4 days before Muhammad Ali was supposed to fight George Foreman in the most dangerous bout of his career, he vanished. Not kidnapped, not injured, not hiding, just gone, walking out of his hotel in Kinshasa without telling anyone where he was going or when he'd return. And when he came back 96 hours later, something in his eyes had changed, as if he'd fought a battle nobody else could see and won before the first punch was ever thrown. What happens in the silence before a fight that everyone thinks you'll lose? October 26, 1974, 6 in the morning, and the sun over Kinshasa was already promising heat that would make training feel like punishment. Muhammad Ali's hotel room at the Intercontinental showed signs of a restless night. Sheets twisted, pillows on the floor, the kind of disorder that comes from a mind that won't stop working even when the body desperately needs rest. He'd been in Zaire for weeks now, preparing for what everyone kept calling a suicide mission, fighting George Foreman, the youngest and most destructive heavyweight champion in boxing history. The man who demolished Joe Frazier in 2 rounds. The man who destroyed Ken Norton in the same time. The man whose punches on the heavy bag sounded like gunshots and whose sparring partners had started refusing to work with him because the danger felt too real. And Ali, 32 years old, slower than he'd been, coming off fights where he'd looked vulnerable, was supposed to step into a ring with this monster and somehow survive. Everyone had an opinion about what would happen. None of those opinions included Ali winning. How do you prepare to fight someone when the entire world has already written your eulogy? The training hadn't been going well. Angelo Dundee, his trainer since the beginning, tried to maintain optimism, but his eyes told a different story. Ali's sparring sessions were rough. He was getting hit more than he should, his legs weren't moving the way they used to, and the speed that had defined his career seemed to have taken a vacation without leaving a forwarding address. Bundini Brown, his cornerman and hype man, still shouted encouragement, still tried to fill Ali with belief, but even Bundini's voice had taken on a desperate edge, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as Ali. The press was worse. Every day, reporters would corner Ali, asking variations of the same question. Why are you doing this? Don't you know Foreman is going to hurt you? Aren't you too old for this? One particularly blunt journalist had asked if Ali had made funeral arrangements, which was supposed to be a joke but landed with the weight of genuine concern. Ali had laughed it off, done his usual routine, predicted the round he'd win in, called Foreman names, performed for the cameras. But alone in his room afterward, the performance ended, and what remained was a 32-year-old man staring at the ceiling, wondering if everyone else was right, and he was just too stubborn to admit it. Can you tell when your body is failing you, or does pride create blindness that looks like confidence? George Foreman's training camp might as well have been a horror movie for Ali's team. Every day, news would filter over about what Foreman had done. Demolished another heavy bag, knocked out another sparring partner, lifted weights that seemed impossible for a human being to move. Foreman trained with the systematic efficiency of a man who wasn't preparing for a fight, but rather an execution. He barely spoke to reporters, didn't need to. His fists did the talking, and they spoke in a language of absolute violence. When asked about Ali, Foreman would just smile slightly and say things like, A's going to find out what real power feels like, or, I hope his corner knows when to stop it, because I won't. The psychological warfare was one-sided. Ali talked because that's what Ali did, but his words were hitting air. Foreman didn't care about trash talk. He cared about breaking things, and Ali was just the next thing on his list to break. And watching this from across the compound, seeing the destruction Foreman casually inflicted on equipment and humans alike, Ali felt something he'd rarely felt in his boxing career, genuine fear. Not anxiety, not nervous energy. Fear, the kind that sits in your stomach and asks questions you don't want to answer. What do you do when fear becomes something you can't talk or dance your way out of? That's when he disappeared. No announcement, no explanation, just gone. He woke up at 6, got dressed in simple clothes. Not training gear, not the flashy outfits he wore for press conferences, just plain shirt and pants that wouldn't draw attention, and walked out of his hotel with a small bag. He didn't tell Veronica, his wife. Didn't tell Angelo. Didn't tell Herbert Muhammad, his manager. Just walked out into Kinshasa as the city was waking up, got into a car he'd apparently arranged the night before, and drove away from everything. 3 hours later, when Angelo came to Ali's room for their morning strategy session, he found it empty. Checked the gym. Not there. Asked around. Nobody had seen him. Called his room. No answer. By noon, Herbert Muhammad was panicking. By 3 p.m., Don King was screaming at everyone, convinced his $10 million fight was about to collapse because one of the fighters had vanished into Central Africa. By evening, Mobutu Sese Seko, the dictator who was hosting this fight as a propaganda spectacle, had his people quietly looking for Ali without alerting the press. Because if word got out that Muhammad Ali had disappeared 4 days before the biggest fight in boxing history, it would confirm what everyone already suspected. He was running. He was scared. He couldn't handle the pressure. But Angelo Dundee, who'd known Ali longer than almost anyone, said something that made everyone pause. He's done this before. Not exactly this, but he needs to be alone sometimes. He'll come back. The question nobody asked out loud, but what if he doesn't? What if fear finally won? Ali drove for 2 hours, leaving Kinshasa behind, heading into rural Zaire where the roads were dirt and the buildings were sparse and the pace of life was dictated by sun and rain rather than clocks and schedules. He ended up in a small village. Never said the name publicly, maybe never knew it, where people looked at him with curiosity but not recognition. He was just another tall man passing through, maybe American, maybe not, interesting but not extraordinary. And for the first time in years, Muhammad Ali was anonymous. Nobody wanted an autograph. Nobody asked for predictions. Nobody needed him to be the greatest. He was just Muhammad, a stranger, and the relief of that anonymity was almost physical. He found a spot by a river, sat down on a fallen tree, and just stopped. Stopped performing. Stopped strategizing. Stopped being Muhammad Ali, heavyweight contender, and just existed as a human being trying to figure out if he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. The river moved slowly, brown with silt, and he watched it for hours without any particular thought, just watching water do what water does. Flow, regardless of who's watching or what it means. How long had it been since he'd just sat somewhere without purpose? How long since silence didn't feel like something that needed filling? Can you remember who you are when you strip away everything people expect you to be? The first 24 hours were about escape, getting away from the pressure, the expectations, the constant voices telling him what he should do, what he couldn't do, what was going to happen to him. A local family, seeing this stranger sitting by the river as evening came, invited him to share their meal. Fufu and fish, simple food eaten with hands, sitting on the ground. He introduced himself as Muhammad, just Muhammad, and they accepted it without question. They didn't know about boxing, didn't care about George Foreman. They talked about their crops, their children, their village. One of the men asked what brought him to Zaire, and Ali Muhammad said simply, "I have something difficult to do, and I needed to think about it." The man nodded, understanding without needing details, and said, "Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight before we ever raise our fists." And Muhammad, Ali, felt something in his chest relax slightly, because yes, exactly that. The family offered him a place to sleep, a simple room with a mat on the floor, and he accepted. That night, lying in darkness without air conditioning or television or any of the amenities his American life provided, he slept better than he had in weeks. Not because the accommodations were comfortable, but because for the first time since arriving in Zaire, he wasn't Muhammad Ali the fighter. He was just a man, and that man didn't have to prove anything to anyone until morning. Is there freedom in anonymity? And if there is, what does it mean when you've spent your whole life building a name everyone recognizes? The second 24 hours were harder. The escape high wore off, and what remained was the question he'd been avoiding: why are you doing this? Not the pat answers he gave reporters, because I'm the greatest, because Foreman needs to be taught a lesson. But the real answer: the one he'd have to give himself when nobody else was listening. He walked through the village, played with children who didn't know they were playing with a legend, helped a woman carry water from the river because he saw her struggling and his body still worked for something besides hitting people. And walking those dirt paths, doing simple tasks, he thought about his life. About winning the Olympic gold medal and coming home to Louisville where restaurants still wouldn't serve him. About beating Sonny Liston and becoming the youngest heavyweight champion in history. About refusing Vietnam and losing everything. The title, the money, the prime years of his career. About coming back and beating Joe Frazier in their third fight, proving he still had something left. And now this, George Foreman. The fight that could erase everything he'd rebuilt or cement his legend. But why? Why risk it when he could retire now, comfortable, secure in his legacy? The answer, when it finally came, wasn't noble. It wasn't about proving doubters wrong or inspiring people. It was simpler and more human-y because he needed to know if he still could. Not if he could beat Foreman specifically, but if he still had the ability to face something terrifying and not run. If the man who'd refused to step forward for Vietnam, who'd chosen principle over safety, still existed inside the aging body and the slower reflexes. Can you ever know who you are until you test yourself against something you might not survive? And if you never test yourself, do you spend the rest of your life wondering? The third day, sitting by that river again, Ali started thinking about the fight itself. Not the pageantry, not the press conferences, but the actual violence of two men trying to hurt each other. George Foreman was stronger. Objectively, measurably stronger. He was younger. His punches had ended careers. His intimidation was so complete that fighters would lose to him mentally before the first bell rang. Everything about this matchup favored Foreman. Everything. But sitting there, watching the river flow, Ali realized something: Foreman had never fought someone who wouldn't run. Every opponent had either tried to slug with him, which meant getting destroyed by superior power, or had tried to move away from him, which meant getting tracked down and destroyed eventually. But what if someone just let him punch? What if someone took the power shots on their arms, their gloves, absorbed the storm and waited? Foreman had never gone past 5 rounds. He'd never needed to. His body was built for explosion, not endurance, and Ali, older, slower, less powerful, had been 12 rounds, 15 rounds, through wars of attrition where survival mattered more than domination. The strategy formed not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow understanding: make Foreman punch himself out. Take his power away not by avoiding it, but by proving it wasn't enough. Let him be strong. Let him be young. And when he got tired, when his arms got heavy and his chest started burning, and he realized power alone wasn't winning, then strike. The tactic didn't have a name yet. The world would call it rope-a-dope after seeing it in action. But here, in rural Zaire, with nobody watching, it was just a thought. What if the only way to beat the strongest man in the world is to let him discover his strength has limits? Is patience a strategy, or just another word for survival? The 4th day, Ali woke up knowing it was time to go back. Not because he'd solved everything, not because fear had disappeared, but because he'd made peace with something essential. Whatever happened in that ring, he'd chosen it. Not because promoters demanded it. Not because the world expected it. But because he'd decided, sitting by a river in a village whose name he didn't know, that facing Foreman was less frightening than spending the rest of his life wondering if he could have. He said goodbye to the family who'd hosted him. Left them money they initially refused but eventually accepted when he explained it wasn't charity, but gratitude, and started the drive back to Kinshasa. The city appeared on the horizon like returning to a different world. Noise and chaos and density after days of simplicity and quiet. And pulling up to the Intercontinental Hotel, seeing the crowd of people waiting, his team, reporters who'd somehow heard he was returning, Don King looking like he'd aged 5 years in 4 days. Ali felt the weight of his identity settle back onto his shoulders. He was Muhammad Ali again. The performance had to resume. But underneath it, he carried something the river had given him: stillness. The knowledge that beneath all the noise and expectation and fear, he knew what he was going to do and why. Can you carry peace into chaos, or does chaos always win? He was about to find out. The hotel lobby erupted when he walked in. Angelo Dundee practically tackled him. "Where the hell have you been?" "The fight is in 3 days! You can't just disappear!" Herbert Muhammad was speechless, just staring like he was seeing a ghost. Don King was ranting about contracts and obligations and nearly having a heart attack. And Ali, calm in a way he hadn't been before leaving, just smiled and said 5 words, "Needed to think." Angelo, who'd worked with Ali long enough to recognize when pushing wouldn't help, just shook his head. "Think. You needed to think. You couldn't think here." And Ali, still smiling, said something that didn't make sense to anyone else but made perfect sense to him. "Not here. Here, I'm what everyone needs me to be. There, I was just me. And I needed to talk to just me for a while." The press conference that afternoon was mandatory. Don King insisted, needing to control the narrative before rumors spread that Ali had fled in fear. Reporters crowded into the room, questions ready, cameras focused, all of them expecting Ali to be defensive, apologetic, to explain himself. Instead, he walked in looking more relaxed than he had since arriving in Zaire. When asked where he'd been, he gave a non-answer. "I was preparing." When asked if he was scared of Foreman, he laughed, genuinely laughed, and said, scared, "Man, I just spent 4 days figuring out how I'm going to beat him. Y'all should be asking if Foreman's scared." And when one persistent journalist pushed, "But seriously, where were you?" Ali leaned into the microphone and said something that would only make sense after the fight. "I was somewhere George Foreman couldn't reach me. And on October 30th, he still won't be able to. What do you say to someone who's made peace with an outcome nobody else can see? And how do you argue with certainty that doesn't need to justify itself?" George Foreman heard about Ali's disappearance and reappearance, and his first reaction was contempt. He ran. He got scared and ran. Even Foreman's trainer, Dick Sadler, dismissed it. "Ali's playing games. It's what he does. Won't matter in the ring." But there was one moment, never reported widely but confirmed years later, when Foreman saw Ali after his return. They crossed paths in the hotel, Ali heading to his room, Foreman coming from training. They made eye contact. Ali smiled. Not the performative smile he gave cameras, but something quieter, more knowing. And Foreman felt something he'd never felt before a fight: doubt. Not fear of Ali. Doubt about his own certainty. Because Ali's eyes didn't show fear, didn't show bravado. Showed something else entirely. Peace. And peace in an opponent is more unsettling than rage or fear, because it suggests they know something you don't, that they've already fought a version of this fight you haven't seen. Foreman shook off the feeling, told himself he was imagining things, went back to destroying heavy bags. But the image stayed with him, Ali smiling like a man who'd already won something that had nothing to do with boxing. How do you intimidate someone who's already confronted whatever they were afraid of? And what happens when your greatest weapon, fear, stops working? The fight itself, 4 days later, would prove that whatever Ali found in those 96 hours of silence, it was real. The rope-a-dope strategy, letting Foreman punch himself into exhaustion while Ali absorbed shots on the ropes, then countering when Foreman's arms got heavy. Worked not because it was brilliant tactics, though it was, but because Ali had the mental fortitude to implement it. Taking punishment requires more than physical toughness. It requires absolute certainty that the plan will work, that the pain is temporary, that survival leads to victory. And that certainty, that stillness under pressure, came from those 4 days. Ali would take shots that would have broken other fighters' will, and he'd talk to Foreman. "That all you got, George? My grandmother hits harder." Not just trash talk, but genuine belief that Foreman's power couldn't break what Ali had built by that river. 8 rounds of this. Foreman throwing everything he had, Ali absorbing it, waiting. And then in round 8, when Foreman's arms were dead and his chest was heaving, Ali struck. A combination Foreman was too tired to defend, and the youngest champion in heavyweight history was on his back, counted out. while Ali stood over him, having pulled off the greatest upset in boxing history. But the upset didn't happen that night in Zaire. It happened 4 days earlier, in a village nobody remembers, by a river that never knew Muhammad Ali walked beside it. That's where the fight was won. Everything else was just confirmation. Do the most important victories happen in public, or in the private moments when we decide who we're going to be when tested? And can anyone else ever really understand what it took to reach that decision? Years later, when Ali's career was over and Parkinson's had slowed his speech but not his memory, a journalist asked him about those 4 days. Where did you really go? What did you do? And Ali, taking his time with words that came harder now, said, I went to a place where I wasn't the champion, where I was just Muhammad, and I asked myself if I was willing to die in that ring. Not being dramatic, really die. Because that's what everyone thought would happen. And I realized the answer was yes. If I died being myself, making my own choice. Not running, not hiding, facing it. And once I knew I was willing to die, Foreman couldn't scare me anymore. Death couldn't scare me. I'd already made peace with the worst thing that could happen. So what was left to be afraid of? He paused, smiled slightly, and added, that river taught me something. It didn't care who I was. It just flowed. And I needed to learn how to flow too. Not fight everything. Not force everything. Just flow, and trust that flowing doesn't mean you're not strong. Sometimes it means you're strong enough to not have to prove it every second. The journalist didn't know what to do with that answer. It was too philosophical, too removed from the Ali was crazy but it worked narrative most people preferred. But for Ali, sitting there with trembling hands and a body that had paid the price for all those fights, it was the truth. The simplest truth he had. 96 hours of silence taught him how to survive the noise. And surviving the noise, the expectations, the fear, the pressure, was harder than surviving George Foreman's fists. Can you separate who you are from what everyone needs you to be? And if you can, even for just 4 days, does it give you enough strength to face anything? Ali thought so. And on October 30th, 1974, in front of 60,000 people in Kinshasa, he proved it. But the proof was private too, because what Ali brought back from that river wasn't just a strategy for beating Foreman. It was something deeper. An understanding that the hardest fights aren't against opponents you can see, but against the voices that tell you who you should be, what you should fear, why you should quit. He spent 96 hours fighting those voices in silence, and he won. The fight in Zaire was just the public display of a private victory. How many people watching on television, seeing Ali weather Foreman's storm and somehow emerge triumphant, had any idea that the real triumph had happened days earlier? How many people celebrating the knockout knew that the fight was won sitting by a river, making peace with death, learning to flow? Probably none. Because that's the thing about the most important moments. They're usually invisible. They happen in hotel rooms and riversides and conversations with yourself that nobody else hears. The world sees the results, the championships, the victories, the iconic photographs. But the moments that created those results stay hidden, known only to the person who lived them. And maybe that's how it should be. Maybe some victories are too personal to share. Maybe some battles are meant to be fought alone, in silence, with only the river as witness. Ali never told anyone the exact location of that village, never named the family who hosted him, never gave specific details about what he thought or felt during those 96 hours. He kept it private, his secret, his sanctuary. And maybe, sitting there decades later, his body failing but his mind still sharp, his hands shaking from disease but his spirit somehow still flowing like that river, maybe he smiled thinking about those 4 days. Not because of what came after, not because of the victory or the fame or the legacy, but because for 96 hours he'd been free, free from expectations, free from fear, free from being Muhammad Ali, just free. And maybe that freedom, however brief, was the real victory. Everything else was just details. Do you need the world to understand your private victories? Or is it enough that you know what you survived, what you faced, what you conquered when nobody was watching? Ali chose the latter. And in choosing it, He found something no opponent could ever take from him: peace. Even if it only lasted 96 hours, it was real. And sometimes, 96 hours of real is worth more than a lifetime of performance. How would you spend 96 hours if you needed to face your greatest fear? And when you came back, would anyone recognize what had changed in your eyes?